There is a moment in every man's life when he realizes that the world is not what it pretends to be, that the strength he admires, the confidence he seeks, the character he trusts, it can all be a carefully constructed lie. A mask worn well, but a mask nonetheless. We live in a world that rewards a good performance, a compelling narrative, the man who is simply the loudest. You can fake discipline for a while. You can even fake ambition. But strength is not a costume you can wear. It's a silence you possess. In the shadow-drenched courts of Renaissance Italy, where trust was a luxury and betrayal was a political strategy, there was a man who understood this deeper truth better than anyone. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli. He was surrounded by liars, opportunists, and cowards, and he knew that he couldn't afford to merely guess who was strong and who was simply making noise. He didn't just need to analyze men, he had to dissect them. He had to know the psychological fault lines, the subtle, precise behaviors that betray the truth, regardless of the words being spoken. Weakness, he learned, doesn't announce itself with a shout. It slips through the cracks. While a strong man stays calm and silent, the weak man exposes himself through unconscious patterns. And for Machiavelli, spotting these patterns was like gaining an advantage, a dagger he could use. Most people would miss them entirely, but he studied men like a predator studies movement. And in his study, he uncovered 3 distinct, almost humiliating behaviors that instantly give a weak man away. The first behavior is perhaps the most subtle, yet it's the most telling. He called it overjustification. The principle is brutally simple. Strong men decide. Weak men explain. Observe the man who constantly defends his choices. The one who feels compelled to over-explain his actions, or who tirelessly tries to make every person in the room understand his logic. He is not being honest. He is being profoundly insecure. Machiavelli saw this in the prince's court every single day. The prince, secure in his authority, spoke little. His command was his justification. But the minister, the courtier, the merchant, the man pretending to be important, he talked constantly. He needed others to agree with his logic, not because he cared about their opinion, but because he couldn't feel sure of his own logic until they affirmed it. This is the behavior of a person whose entire identity is dependent on being liked, on external validation. It's not the posture of a leader or even a friend. It is, to Machiavelli's cold eye, a man begging for permission to exist. Overjustification is just a smoke screen for a deeper fear. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, and ultimately, fear of real, silent power. Any man who requires approval before he moves, before he acts, before he speaks a truth, can never be trusted with true power. Power, the real, silent kind, demands conviction and the ability to make a move without ever having to explain it to anyone. So, the next time you hear someone constantly explaining their opinion, repeating their point, trying desperately to sound nice or morally correct, understand this: you are not hearing strength. You are hearing an inner collapse in slow motion. But that is only the beginning. The second behavior is far colder and infinitely more dangerous. Weaponized niceness. This is the most deceptive form of weakness because it wears a smile. Machiavelli knew that the most spineless men in his world didn't always look afraid. They looked friendly. They appeared helpful, accommodating, and agreeable. But it was never true kindness. It was submission, cunningly disguised as virtue. A truly strong man can be kind, of course, but his kindness is deliberate, it is selective, and it is never, ever offered at the cost of his self-respect. The weak man, on the other hand, tries to be agreeable at all times. He agrees to smother tension. He compliments to be liked. He remains quiet when his self-respect demands he should speak up. He apologizes not because he is actually wrong, but because he is scared. And what happens when that strategy fails? When being nice doesn't earn him the validation he desperately needs? He flips. He becomes sarcastic. He becomes bitter. He becomes viciously passive-aggressive. His niceness, you see, was never an act of the heart. It was a strategy, a shield to avoid rejection. And when that shield cracks, his genuine resentment leaks out. Machiavelli understood the difference between restraint and fear. He wrote that a prince must know how to do wrong, but only use it when compelled. This is restraint. This is power. But weaponized niceness? That is always fear. It is the posture of someone who doesn't know how to stand tall on his own. So he tries to stay small, hoping no one will notice or step on him. When you see this compulsive friendliness, the kind that turns sour and resentful the moment it's challenged, you have found a man who cannot and must not be trusted with power. Because real power, the kind that lasts, demands the ability to set boundaries, to say no without apology, and to face tension head-on without collapsing into a false, desperate smile. Machiavelli watched for this like a hawk, because he knew it told him that this man's loyalty will break the moment it is tested. But there is a third behavior, a behavior more desperate, more exposed, and utterly humiliating to witness. When you spot this final crack, you know you are standing in front of a man who fears being insignificant more than he fears death itself. Machiavelli instantly classified him as weak because of his display addiction. You know him. You have seen him before. He is the man who always relentlessly needs to be seen. The one who can't sit still without a moment of recognition. He posts constantly. He speaks loudly. He exaggerates every small win and turns every single moment of his life into a breathless performance. Machiavelli saw these men everywhere, and he understood a truth that still escapes most of us. The man who needs to be seen is, at his core, the man who fears being forgotten. And that fear is not the kind that comes from misfortune. It is a profound weakness that comes from a rot deep within his identity. Display addiction is not confidence. It is the panic response of a man with no internal foundation. They believe truly and desperately that if they are not being talked about, if they are not liked, praised, or envied, then they simply do not matter. Their value, their entire existence, disappears the very moment the attention fades. This is precisely why Machiavelli saw them as liabilities. These men, these hollow shells, will do anything for attention. They will lie, they will embellish, they will betray. They will expose secrets, turn on their allies, and manufacture enemies out of thin air, just as long as someone is watching. In their frantic, desperate mind, silence is death. Stillness is irrelevance. Their worst fate is to be forgotten. Machiavelli knew that a man addicted to display is nothing more than a puppet waiting to be controlled. And if you ever want to ruin him, you don't need to attack. You just ignore him. You take away the spotlight. You cut off the applause. You make him feel utterly and completely invisible. Watch how quickly he breaks. Because while strong men train in private, they grow in silence, and they strike only when necessary. The weak man cannot survive 5 minutes without being noticed. He is easy to predict, he is even easier to manipulate, and he is fundamentally impossible to trust. This is why Machiavelli feared weakness more than he feared wickedness. At least the wicked man knows what he wants. The weak man wants everything, but he will trade anything, anyone to get it. When you combine all three behaviors, the compulsive justifier, the fake nice appeaser, and the attention addict, you don't get a villain. you get a void. A man so profoundly hollow that he will take the shape of anyone stronger than himself. Machiavelli's greatest fear wasn't the loud ones or the cruel ones. It was the empty ones, because emptiness, that void, can be filled with anything. And when the wrong person gets close, they fill it with destruction. But here is where Machiavelli took his genius further. He didn't just identify weakness. He used it. He turned these predictable, pathetic behaviors into tools, into leverage points. He knew that spotting a weak man early could mean the difference between maintaining power and falling victim to betrayal. These men, he understood, do not break when tested. They melt. And in the high-stakes games of politics, war, and business, you simply cannot afford to depend on someone who melts. So how do we protect ourselves? How do we adopt this Machiavellian vision? You watch. You stop judging people by their titles, their false smiles, or their carefully chosen words. And you begin judging them by their consistent psychological patterns. You study what they do when no one agrees with them. You look for the cracks when no one is watching them. You observe how they behave when no one praises them, or when no one gives them a reason to act good. You look for the silence, because the strong man doesn't panic in silence. He builds, he sharpens his mind, he plans. The weak man, he performs, he explains, he crumbles. Once you can instantly tell the difference between these two men, you gain a weapon most people never even think to sharpen. Discernment. It is the power to see not just who someone pretends to be, but who they will inevitably become the moment life stops going their way. That Machiavelli knew was how you chose your allies. That was how you avoided collapse. And that is how you outlast everyone who is still fooled by the surface presentation. Because beneath the carefully curated image and the right words, behavior never lies. Machiavelli didn't just spot weakness. He turned it into a ladder for his own ascent. While other men reacted to a weak person with disgust or frustration, Machiavelli reacted with pure strategy. Because once you know a man's emotional fault line, once you understand how he thinks, how he panics, and the exact approval he craves, you don't need to argue with him. You don't need to fight him. You just guide him, like a quiet rope pulling a puppet from behind a curtain. He understood the critical, painful truth. The weak man wants to be led. He just doesn't want to feel controlled. So, Machiavelli gave them exactly what their weakness demanded. He offered them a rare bit of praise when they felt ignored. He gave them a nod of agreement when they felt deeply insecure. He offered them flattery when they were starving for validation. Not because he respected them, but because he saw how easily they could be shaped. His true power, therefore, did not come from sheer strength alone. He didn't force anyone to obey him. He made the weak obey themselves by offering them just enough emotional candy to keep them utterly addicted to his approval. It was a system. He would spot the justifier, the man who needed to explain everything. And instead of challenging his overly long logic, Machiavelli would listen, nodding, holding eye contact, and saying simply, "That makes perfect sense." Instantly, that man would attach himself, a desperate emotional anchor, craving more of that rare, sweet validation. He would become willing to support Machiavelli, defend him, even spy for him, all because Machiavelli had made him feel understood. But it was never understanding. It was calculated leverage. Then he would turn to the people-pleaser, the man who was always nice, helpful, and agreeable. He would give him a small but important job, make him feel chosen, let him feel safe, like he was finally part of something powerful. That man would never betray Machiavelli, not out of genuine loyalty, but because betrayal would mean losing the one and only thing keeping his fragile identity from completely shattering. And finally, there was the display addict, the one who needed attention like he needed air. To that man, Machiavelli offered the stage. He would let him speak in meetings. He would let him take very public credit for ideas that were perfectly serving Machiavelli's own silent goals. He let him wear the shimmering costume of influence. While behind the scenes, Machiavelli was the one silently writing the entire script. He knew that if you give a weak man the illusion of power, he will never once question who actually holds the real power. This is how empires are truly built. Not with war and blood, but with meticulous psychological engineering. You identify the weak, and then you let them build your palace out of their own desperate need to be seen, to be approved, to be included. And if they ever turn on you, you don't fight them. You simply and coldly withdraw the attention. You let them collapse in the utter silence. You watch them destroy themselves in a frantic, desperate attempt to feel powerful again. Because nothing crushes a weak man faster, more completely, than being ignored by the person whose approval shaped him. That is the Machiavellian art of handling weakness. You don't argue with them. You don't expose them publicly. You weaponize them. And as they desperately dance for the spotlight and the applause, you remain still, you remain silent, you just watch. While they chase the applause, you acquire the power. But Machiavelli had one more rule, perhaps the coldest one of all. Never let a weak man believe he is your equal. The moment he does, he forgets who built him. He overreaches. He begins to fantasize about a rebellion. So you keep the gap wide always. You reward just enough to keep him motivated, to keep him moving, but never, ever enough for him to believe he no longer needs you. And if he ever foolishly tries to challenge you, you don't retaliate with anger. You replace him, because there is no shortage of weak men desperate for validation. But there is only one of you. This is the Machiavellian way. Not domination by brute force, but pure direction by instinct. It's not about managing people, it's about puppeteering their insecurities until they are so invested they call it loyalty. You don't need a crown. You don't even need to speak loudly to control the weak men. All you need is understanding of their frailty and silence. The best manipulation, he knew, doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like a rare friendship. It looks like mentorship. It looks like a quiet, profound presence. Because weak men are always watching, not for the truth, but for the signals. They move toward approval like a desperate moth to a flame. And once you know this universal truth, you can shape their entire behavior without ever raising your voice. This is how Machiavelli moved through alliances, courts, and governments without ever needing brute strength. He let the weak men come to him, and then he played a role. He became the quiet, affirming listener to the over-explainer. He was the calm, stable leader to the people-pleaser. He was the shadow architect to the attention-hungry puppet. He didn't resist their fatal flaws. He simply fed them just enough to keep them performing. And in return, he got loyalty without having to expend effort. He gained defenders without having to ask for them. He received obedience without having to issue a single command. If you want to acquire this kind of Machiavellian power, this is what you must understand. The most effective form of control is the kind that the controlled man never sees coming. It is when they are certain the decisions are their own. It is when they truly believe they chose to follow you. It is when they feel proud of the service they are giving you. Not because you demanded it, but because you never had to. Let's break down the execution into 3 simple, profound rules. First, speak less than they expect. The weaker the man, the more desperately he needs verbal affirmation. So you offer silence, strategic silence. You let them overexpose themselves. You let them talk themselves into guilt, into loyalty, into admiration. And when you do finally speak, you make your words feel profoundly earned. That single compliment, that small, affirming nod of approval, that rare piece of counsel, it becomes solid gold in their mind. They will chase it. They will talk about it. And now, they are not just working with you. They are working for something inside them, something precious and rare that you, the silent architect, created. Second, be the calm in their storm. Weak men exist in a state of emotional reactivity. They panic when plans shift. They overcorrect when they receive criticism. They spiral the moment they are ignored. So you do absolutely none of those things. You remain composed. You move with quiet, perfect intention. You become the opposite of their own inner chaos. This intense contrast makes them see you as powerful, without you ever having to claim the title. They begin to think, he must know something I don't. He is in control. I should follow his lead. They project stability onto you because their own identity is crumbling beneath them. And once they do that, your influence becomes both invisible and total. Third, reward with unpredictability. This is the final, essential Machiavellian twist that most people completely miss. You do not reward consistently. You do not allow yourself to become a predictable, constant source of praise or support. You become mysterious. Some days you acknowledge them. Some days you vanish completely. Some days you nod. Some days you don't even look their way. Why? Because uncertainty is the most powerful creator of addiction. They can never know precisely when your approval will arrive. So they keep performing. They keep guessing. They keep talking about you. You become not just a leader in their mind. You become an obsession. And this is where true psychological power begins. Because when they start desperately needing your presence, your guidance, your recognition, they immediately begin to fear your disapproval. You don't have to punish them. Your absence is punishment enough. You don't have to correct them. Your silence becomes a terrifying, inescapable mirror. And now they belong to you, not through a crude fear of threats, but through a deeper, subtler bond, dependency. This is the high art of identifying the weak men and turning their own flaws into the tools of your rise. And the beautiful, silent cruelty of it is that they will never, ever know. They will call it respect. They will call it admiration. They will truly believe they chose this path of their own free will. But you, the silent one, you will know the truth. You saw the cracks. You read the behavior. And while they desperately tried to survive in the noise, you rose in the perfect, calibrated silence. But Machiavelli's final, most critical lesson was this. He had one thing he feared more than being overthrown by his enemies. He feared being betrayed by the weakness within himself. He understood what most people run from. Weakness is not just something you spot in others. It is something you must relentlessly hunt within yourself every single day, because it doesn't arrive in obvious, loud forms. It sneaks in through that impulse to over-explain a decision. It creeps in through the desperate need to be liked. It whispers through the craving for applause. It shows up in the profound silence you should have filled but didn't. It is present in the apology you gave, not because you were wrong, but because you were profoundly afraid. Machiavelli believed that self-mastery was a war, a daily, brutal war. And if you lost even a single battle, the world, the sharp, cold world, would spot the crack in your armor long before you ever did. So he developed his own system, a way to detect the weakness the very moment it whispered in his own mind. First, he watched how he explained himself. When you are strong, you simply make the decision. When you are weak, you explain it. Machiavelli trained himself to notice when he started talking too much, when he repeated a point, when he adjusted his core message based on the room's reaction. Each time, he stopped, and he asked himself one single, piercing question. Is this conviction, or is this a plea for acceptance? And if the answer was the second, he immediately stopped. Because he knew, a man who begs for validation utterly forfeits his own authority. Second, he tested how often he said yes. Most people think a yes is positive and cooperative, but Machiavelli saw it as profoundly dangerous. A weak yes can ruin a kingdom, agreeing simply to avoid a conflict, agreeing solely to gain favor, agreeing without clearly defined boundaries. He trained himself to pause before every single agreement and ask, would I say yes if I didn't fear losing their approval? If the honest answer was a no, he declined. No apology, no elaborate excuse, because the moment your word loses its weight, you lose power, even in your own eyes. Third, he measured how silence felt. Weak men utterly hate silence. They rush to fill it with a joke, with a compliment, with an explanation. They do this because silence is a terrible mirror. It reveals the truth. But Machiavelli made silence his greatest weapon. He practiced it in rooms full of noise. He measured his exact comfort level inside it. And when the silence felt tense, he intentionally leaned into it. Why? Because silence, when fully mastered, becomes an unwavering presence. And presence, when fully mastered, becomes a cold, unshakable intimidation without any intention of intimidation at all. Fourth, he resisted unnecessary exposure. The weak man always wants to be seen right now. The strong man, he chooses precisely when. Machiavelli practiced invisibility. He watched others chase the spotlight, the constant feed of attention. He stayed in the shadows, silent, until every single piece of his strategic plan was perfectly in position. And then, when he finally moved, it was not seen as mere progress. It was seen as an arrival. He didn't build anticipation through a series of grand announcements. He built it through profound, controlled absence. So when he spoke, when he acted, when he finally made his formidable presence known, people quite literally stopped moving. That was no lucky accident. It was trained. It was refined. It was meticulously engineered. He removed every single trace of weak behavior in himself before the world ever had the chance to use it against him. Because Machiavelli didn't just play offense. He methodically closed the doors that others could have used to break him later. And that is what most people fail to do. They try to look powerful, but they never ask themselves the truly piercing questions. Do I chase praise? Do I fear rejection? Do I speak to be heard or to be agreed with? Do I need people to like me before I lead them? Do I explain a decision when pure silence would have been infinitely stronger? These questions do not just reveal weakness. They reveal your ultimate limit. And once you spot them, you have only two options. Feed them and stay exactly where you are, or kill them and become something the world cannot, under any circumstances, ignore. Because in the grim, inevitable march of the world, you don't get punished for being evil. You get punished for being predictable. You get punished for being emotional. You get punished for being weak. So you strip it out. Bit by bit, word by word, calculated decision by decision, until one day you speak and people freeze. You move and people immediately adjust. You lead and no one questions how you got there. because they won't see a man desperately trying to look strong. They will see a man who has been perfectly forged in silence. Respect is not a favor you demand. It is not something you ask for, and it is most certainly not something you beg for. Respect is engineered, and Machiavelli knew the blueprint. He understood that the highest, most profound form of respect, the kind that doesn't fade in your absence, the kind that can silence an entire room before you even speak, comes from one single powerful thing: mastery over what weak men fear most. Weak men fear discomfort. They fear being misunderstood. They fear being intensely disliked. They fear standing utterly alone in a room full of overwhelming noise. But the Machiavellian man embraces it. He doesn't run from tension. He calmly walks straight into it. He doesn't collapse under the weight of judgment. He sharpens under it. Because when you ruthlessly kill the instinct to justify yourself, when you stop seeking applause for your existence, when you remove every single trace of fear-driven behavior, you become something alien to the average man. Something unsettling. Something truly untouchable. And that precisely is why people begin to respect you. Not because you seem nice, and not because you speak the loudest, but because you calmly and confidently reveal nothing. And that terrifies them. It is human nature. We fear what we cannot figure out. So when you walk into a room and don't need to prove a single thing, when you hold your perfect posture while all the others flinch, when your silence feels heavier, more consequential than their very best words, you instantly change the entire dynamic. You stop chasing respect. You become the quiet, magnetic source of it. People begin to shift their tone around you. They speak more carefully. They measure their words precisely because they don't want to be seen as weak in your formidable presence. Why? Because you have mastered what they haven't. You have killed the desperate need for constant validation. You have completely silenced the inner voice that craves fleeting attention. You have made a deep, profound peace with your own solitude, which makes your approval incredibly rare and valuable. This is the final Machiavellian tactic. Make your respect expensive. Don't give it easily. Don't flatter casually. Don't smile for free. Make them genuinely earn it. Because once they realize you cannot be moved by their charm, by their pressure, or by their transient popularity, they will have no choice but to adjust to your high standard. They will rise to it, or they will simply disappear. And either way, you win. You either gain stronger, more calibrated allies, or you expose the ones too weak and desperate to walk beside you. This is how you truly rule. Not with power you shout about, but with a power that is deeply existentially felt. The kind that makes people silently ask themselves, why does he make me feel uncomfortable? Why do I care so much what he thinks of me? What does he see that I don't? That's not crude intimidation. That is a calibrated presence. And presence is built only by the meticulous removal of every behavior that exposes weakness, both in them and, more importantly, in yourself. Because once you have done that, once you have purified your speech, refined your silence, and made your internal identity unshakable, you become precisely what Machiavelli admired most. You become a man who doesn't just command respect. You become a man who simply doesn't give them a choice. Not through cruelty or fear, but through sheer, undeniable, perfect calibration. You have become the standard they measure against, the mirror that instantly reflects their insecurities. You are the quiet, still reminder that strength never, ever needs to introduce itself. So let the weak reveal themselves. Let them talk. Let them seek attention. Let them chase comfort and popularity. And while they do, you build in silence with surgical precision until one day they simply can't stop watching you. and they will never truly understand how they lost to someone who never even played their frantic, noisy game. That is the final, chilling lesson. You don't expose weak men by confronting them. You expose them by never needing to. That is Machiavellian power.